Hello and welcome to PT and Nutrition Education's e-learning platform. Today we are continuing with our preparation for the examination in the Principles of Exercise and Training unit, and as you can see, today's focus will be related to aerobic endurance. So just like we did with strength, we're going to identify the definition of aerobic endurance, we're going to understand the different ways in which to train for aerobic endurance, and we're going to identify the physiological adaptations which occur when we're doing aerobic endurance training. So just like all of the other lectures, there will be some interactive tasks, a work booklet which you will be following, and also practice assessments in order to help you prepare for your exam. So let's get underway. So the first objective relates to the definition of aerobic endurance, and this is quite simply two systems within the body which are contributing in order to help sports performance. Those two systems are the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system, and together they are known as the cardiorespiratory system. So what's happening here is that the respiratory system is taking in oxygen from the atmospheric air, and that is then diffusing via gaseous exchange into our bloodstream. Once that has then been delivered into the bloodstream, it's then the red blood cells which will pick up that oxygen and then deliver that to the working muscles in order for aerobic respiration to take place. So it's the ability of both the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system to work efficiently in supplying oxygen to the working muscles for sustained physical activity. Any athlete, whether they be professional or recreational, will benefit from a high amount of aerobic endurance, because this essentially means that you'll be able to sustain repeated bouts of exercise without getting tired or fatigued. So if we look at certain events or sports which are highly reliant on aerobic endurance, then we'll notice that they are exercises, events, sports which are taking place over longer periods of time. So a 90-minute game of football, for example, would require an athlete to have a high amount of aerobic endurance to sustain those repeated contractions throughout a game. Same for a marathon runner, a long distance runner, triathlete. All of these sports are going to rely on oxygen being delivered to those working muscles in order to resynthesize ATP over a long period of time. So if we take a look closer at some of the anatomical parts which contribute to aerobic endurance performance, and we look specifically at the cardiovascular system to start with, we'll notice that it's the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels which are all contributing to aerobic endurance proficiency. So if we look at the heart, of course, if we have a stronger, more muscular heart, then we're able to pump more blood around the body in which to deliver the oxygen which is needed to the working muscle. The blood contains red blood cells, and within those red blood cells we contain a protein called hemoglobin, and it's that particular protein which will actually bind with oxygen and then help to deliver that to the working muscle. Through adaptation over a long period of time, we can actually increase the amount of red blood cells and the amount of hemoglobin that we have. So of course that's a huge contributor to aerobic endurance performance. And then lastly, we've got the blood vessels, the arteries, the veins, the capillaries. These are essentially the roads in which the oxygen travels in order to be delivered, and also for CO2 to be removed. So all three contributing to aerobic endurance performance. If we look closely at the respiratory system, there are three key structures here. We're talking about the trachea, the lungs themselves, and then the air sacs known as the alveoli. So the trachea has an ability to dilate and open up. So of course, if we have a dilated trachea, this means that we're able to get more oxygen into the lung. The lungs themselves, we have lung capacity which can be increased through training and through years of aerobic endurance training. So of course, the more efficient lungs we have, the more oxygen that we can diffuse into our bloodstream. And the alveoli, which are the air sacs right at the end where gaseous exchange takes place, if we have a greater surface area, this means that more oxygen can be passed onto the capillaries into the bloodstream, so that oxygen once again can be delivered to those working muscles. And again, by the same token, CO2 can be removed and it is out of the system via expiration. Okay, so you might be wondering, how is it that we train in order to improve aerobic endurance, to improve the proficiency of the cardiovascular system and or the respiratory system. So there are three main types of training which are identified in the Principles of Exercise and Training unit in order to improve aerobic endurance. The first one is known as fartlek training. So this is Swedish for speed play. And much like interval training, this is where we have bouts of high intensity exercise followed by potential rest periods or periods of lower intensity activity. However, unlike interval training, this is where we can change the gradient, so going up or downhill, and also change the surface. So we could be running on different surfaces such as grass, concrete, sand, as you can see in the picture here. So this is fartlek training. We also have continuous training. So as the name suggests, this is training continuously at a steady pace for a long period of time. So here we're talking about steady state runs, cycles, rows, anything along those lines that's going to keep the heart beating and delivering oxygen over long periods, which of course essentially is the very definition of aerobic endurance. And then lastly, we have interval training. So this has certainly become more popular in recent years, especially when it comes to some of the research around its fat burning effect. But interval training is very simply a period of high intensity work followed by a period of either low, moderate intensity work or indeed rest. So we have that once very similar to fartlek training, that speed play of that intermittent performance over a period of time. This may mean that we can actually perform at a higher intensity, allow the body to recover, and then we go again. So that repeated bout of exercise does have a positive benefit when it comes to aerobic endurance. So if we look more specifically at aerobic endurance and how we train for it using our principles of training, that is frequency, intensity, time and type, then we can look closely at what is known as our VO2 max. So VO2 stands for volume of oxygen, and this is essentially the maximum amount of oxygen that you can take in and that your body can use per kilogram of body weight per minute. So basically the higher VO2 max that we have, then the higher our aerobic capacity. It doesn't necessarily mean that our aerobic endurance performance will be better. Okay, so if I have the highest VO2 max, this means that I'm going to win the 5,000 meter race. What it means is that my body's ability to use oxygen is going to be greater. Therefore, the potential for aerobic endurance performance increases. Of course, there are many other factors at play when it comes to elite performance. So what is it that we should be doing in terms of our frequency, intensity, time and type? So the first thing that we can look at is the duration. And of course, when it comes to exercise and aerobic endurance, then we need to be ensuring there is a minimum effective dose. So the minimum amount of time that you should be training in order to innovate the aerobic system and therefore be working the heart, the muscles and our respiratory system to a substantial rate where adaptation is going to occur is around 20 minutes. We should be trying to do this 3 to 5 times per week as a minimum if we're looking to improve aerobic endurance. And we should be trying to do this with a heart rate between 60 and 80% of our maximum. Now, if you're wondering how we figure out our maximum heart rate, we're going to find this out on our next slide where we talk about heart rate training zones and how we can use them in order to plan a client program who may be interested in increasing their aerobic endurance. As you can see, this is very similar to the 1 rep max percentages that we use when strength training. So if we stick between a certain percentage, then we're working the aerobic system and we're not working anaerobically. So it's really important that we have a really good understanding of the heart rate training zones so you can ensure that you're training for aerobic endurance, which of course is training specificity, making sure that we are working the aerobic system substantially where adaptation is going to occur, but also making sure that we're not working at too higher of intensity where anaerobic energy systems are going to become predominant. So when it comes to monitoring intensity of exercise, there are two ways in which to do this. In fact, there are more, but the two main ways are identifying what our maximum heart rate is, and we can do this by taking 220 beats per minute and then minusing our age. So if we take someone, for example, who is 20 years of age, then their maximum heart rate will be around 200. And then from that, we can work out between 60 and 80% of that person's heart rate in order for them to be working aerobically. If we don't have the luxury of heart rate equipment, then we have what's known as the Rating of Perceived Exertion, or RPE scale. And this is referred to as a scale between 6 and 20 on what's known as the Borg scale. And what we should do is train our participant to use this Borg scale in order to determine how hard they're finding the exercise if we don't have access to heart rate data. So as you can see from the table at the bottom here, okay, heart rate does actually positively correlate with the Borg scale, and there have been plenty of literature talking about the efficacy of the Borg scale and RPE measure if we don't have access to heart rate equipment. So really what we should be seeing if someone's using the Borg scale effectively is that if they are on a scale of 9 or below, so between 6 and 9, then their heart rate should be between 90 beats per minute. If they're at 10 and 11, then it's between 100 and 110 beats per minute. 12 and 13, 120 to 130. And as you can see, this correlates quite nicely with the numbers of the Borg scale and the numbers of beats per minute. So if we're above 16, between 16 and 20, then we know we're probably verging on entering into some of the anaerobic energy systems, as that can be quite heavy aerobic/anaerobic work. So there we have it, some of the ways in which we can monitor intensity during aerobic endurance training, and for you as a personal trainer, something that might be really useful to you as you plan and you deliver your training programs to your clients. And lastly, we focus on the physiological adaptations which occur when we're doing aerobic endurance training. So as you can see there, the first one is an increase in size and number of the mitochondria. Now, if you remember, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, and this is where all aerobic respiration takes place. So here, oxygen combines with glucose and fat in order to resynthesize ATP. Of course, this is all about reproducing energy, resynthesizing energy, and the more powerhouses that we have, the more power stations that we have, the more energy we're going to be able to produce, and therefore this is going to contribute to a more energy efficient muscle. The process of actually growing more mitochondria is a process known as mitochondrial biogenesis, and through many different types of processes, which we won't go into today, mitochondria can contribute to improved VO2 max and aerobic endurance. So whilst we speak about increasing aerobic performance, of course, we've already mentioned that an ability to use more oxygen and deliver that to the working muscles is potentially going to equal an increased aerobic performance. So increased aerobic performance via the mechanism of increasing the amount of oxygen that we can use and improving our VO2 max really should be the main aim of aerobic endurance training. The third adaptation on the list relates to an increase in aerobic enzymes and the ability to use fat as a fuel. So first off, if we remember, enzymes are all about breaking fuels down. The more enzymes we have, the more fuel that we can potentially break down, and therefore the more energy that we can reproduce. And then the ability to use fat as a fuel is going to be advantageous, given that fat is a pretty much inexhaustible fuel source that we have in the form of adipose tissue that we have stored in the body. Glucose and glycogen do provide quicker turnover of ATP. However, glycogen does have a finite storage capacity, and therefore using fat as a fuel can essentially save some of that important glycogen for more important parts of a race, event, or exercise. As we've mentioned before, if we're using fat as a fuel, this therefore requires a higher oxygen uptake, and therefore if we improve our aerobic endurance and our VO2 max, then we're able to tap in to more fat as a fuel and therefore benefit from this when it comes to dual fueling using both carbohydrate and fat during exercise performance. There is also an increase in myoglobin. Now, myoglobin is essentially the bus which takes oxygen from the bloodstream into the mitochondria. Now, of course, if we have more buses taking this oxygen from the bloodstream into the mitochondria in order for ATP resynthesis to occur, then of course that's only going to mean a positive outcome when it comes to our aerobic endurance performance. And then lastly, as we've covered in the muscular system at length, slow twitch muscle fibers, which have a whole host of characteristics related to aerobic endurance performance, can increase in size. So they don't increase in size much like a fast twitch fiber does. However, an increase in size of the slow twitch muscle fibers means that we have a bigger capacity for potential of more myoglobin, mitochondria, and therefore aerobic endurance performance. So these again are just a handful of some of the physiological adaptations which occur when we're training with aerobic endurance protocols. And to complete aerobic endurance, once again there is a task in your work booklet, Unit 4 Principles of Exercise, Fitness and Health. If you turn to the aerobic endurance page, you'll see there that you're asked to fill out the definitions, the types of training, the training protocols, and the training adaptations. So good luck, and we'll see you over at the next video.